People love to call the Brewster Buffalo one of the worst fighters of World War II. And if your first mental picture is a buffalo getting chewed up over places like Malaya or Midway, that verdict feels obvious. Too slow, too heavy, too unforgiving once the fight turns vertical. And in the versions that mattered most in 1941 to 42, it could feel like an airplane that showed up to the wrong war. But that reputation didn't start in the jungle or over open ocean. It started earlier, when the Navy was trying to drag carrier aviation out of the biplane era. In the mid-1930s, the US Navy needed a modern carrier-based fighter to replace aging biplanes, with the Grumman F-3F still sitting at the center of the lineup. So in November 1935, the Navy issued a formal requirement, and 3 manufacturers answered the call. Grumman submitted the XF-4F1, but it was still a biplane idea. Grumman soon backed away, realizing the monoplane age had arrived, and went back to redesign, work that would eventually produce the F-4F Wildcat. Seversky offered the XFN-1, essentially a navalized P-35. It couldn't reach the required airspeeds, and it was out. That left Brewster with the Model B-139, the design that would become the XF-2A, the one modern-looking option still standing when the dust settled. Brewster's answer looked, at least on paper, like the Navy's future arriving early. The prototype, designated XF-2A, was a clean, modern package for its moment. An all-metal monoplane, an enclosed cockpit, and fully retractable landing gear with a tailwheel. It was built to live on a carrier too, with an arresting hook for deck landings, and it used hydraulically powered split flaps, the kind of new-school hardware the Navy wanted as it stepped away from biplanes. Up front sat a 9-cylinder Wright Cyclone, rated around 950 horsepower, turning a 3-blade propeller. The planned armament was straightforward and very Navy. 1.50 caliber Browning M2 paired with 1.30 caliber Browning M1919, both mounted in the nose. The XF-2A first flew on December 2, 1937, and early service testing in 1938 delivered a reality check. It wasn't even cracking 300 miles per hour, not the kind of number that wins arguments in a fighter competition. Then came the turning point the transcript keeps coming back to: Langley's full-scale wind tunnel. Tests exposed airflow problems, and Brewster reworked the areas that mattered most, especially the engine cowling and air intakes. With those fixes, top speed climbed to about 304 miles per hour, and pilots started saying the words Brewster needed to hear. The XF-2A turned well, and had good handling when flown the way it was meant to be flown. Up to this point, the story is mostly about an airframe that could be improved, and was improved. But the real break in the Buffalo's reputation didn't happen in a wind tunnel. It happened on the factory floor. The Navy awarded Brewster a contract to build 54 aircraft, and that's where the trouble started. Brewster had been a relatively small operation, an aircraft parts supplier that had also dabbled in building complete airplanes. Producing fighters at scale was a different job entirely, and it became obvious fast that their facilities and workflow simply weren't up to it. Deliveries came in slow, then slower, and then painfully late. The transcript puts a hard number on it. By the time the Navy should have been completing delivery of that batch of 54, the service had received only 11. That's not a small delay. That's a production system failing in real time, right as carrier aviation is trying to modernize. And those missing airframes didn't just vanish. The remaining aircraft in that order were eventually treated as surplus, and they ended up going to the Finnish air arm, which was already fighting for its life against the Soviet Union. This is the key point the video keeps pushing. A big part of the Buffalo's bad name is welded to Brewster itself. Its industrial capacity, its management, its ability to deliver what it promised. The airplane could be made to perform better. the company struggled to build it when it mattered most. By the time Brewster was trying to catch up on deliveries, the Navy was already moving on to improved versions of the aeroplane, and each step shows the pattern that follows the Buffalo through the war. The upgrades made sense, but the weight bill kept coming due. The next major version was the F2A2. It brought a set of practical day-to-day improvements, quality of life changes, along with an updated Cyclone engine. On paper, the performance looked healthier. The source quotes a top speed of about 323 miles per hour at altitude, a meaningful jump from the early prototype numbers. But the limitation was still baked into the engine setup, a single-stage supercharger. At higher altitudes, performance fell off hard, and that made the Buffalo far less attractive to European buyers whose newer fighters could climb higher and keep their speed. The aircraft still had a place, just not in the kind of high-altitude air war Europe was preparing for. Then came the F2A3, and this is where the transcript's tone shifts. In several ways it was better, but it could feel worse. The Navy pushed for the features frontline pilots had been asking for: a 2-speed supercharger to help altitude performance, self-sealing fuel tanks, larger fuselage tanks, armor protection for the pilot, which earlier Buffaloes completely lacked, and improved radio equipment. The cost was weight, roughly an extra 500 pounds, and that weight went straight at the Buffalo's most praised traits. The turning and handling that pilots had liked early on were blunted, and there was a carrier problem that couldn't be waved away: the landing gear. The Navy found it wasn't up to repeated flight deck impacts. Even with slow, smooth landings, the struts were often damaged. They strengthened the gear to fight it, but the transcript makes the limit clear. To truly fix it would have required a complete redesign of the aircraft. By the time the F2A3 was arriving, the Navy's patience was running out. And it wasn't just because of Brewster's production headaches. Grumman had come back into the picture with a very different answer: the F4F Wildcat, a monoplane design that was quickly turning heads in Navy trials and looked like a safer bet for frontline carrier work. At that point, the direction became clear. Once the current Buffalo production run was finished, the Navy wasn't going to keep ordering more. The Buffalo hadn't become useless overnight, but it had been overtaken, and the Navy had a new priority aircraft. So the Buffaloes still in Navy service didn't stay there for long. They were gradually shifted over to the US Marine Corps, setting up the next phase of the story, where the airplane would finally see major combat, and where its reputation would take the hardest hit. And this is where the Buffalo's story turns from paperwork and prototypes into consequences. The first Buffaloes that reached Great Britain weren't even meant for Britain at all. They were originally bound for Belgium, but after Belgium fell, the order was transferred. The aircraft were assigned to the Fleet Air Arm, specifically 805 Squadron and 885 Squadron, and the shortcomings showed up quickly. Instead of becoming a frontline answer, they were pushed out to the places that needed fighters now, the Far East. Soon, Buffaloes were sitting on fields in Burma, Singapore, and Malaya, arriving just in time to face the leading edge of the Japanese invasion. The transcript makes an ugly point that matters. The Buffalo Britain received was inferior to the original specification it expected. Compared to what the Navy had been flying as the F2A2 standard, these aircraft were heavier, slower, and less aerodynamic. In some cases, the performance was so compromised that pilots reported aircraft that struggled to pull off vertical loops. That is not a small flaw in a fight that is about energy and climb. When Japan came in, the Buffalo could still hold its own against earlier opponents like the Ki-27 and Ki-43. But against the A6M0, it was simply outclassed, and that gap got brutally obvious as the campaign unfolded. By March 1942, the few remaining serviceable aircraft were being flown in Burma. while Dutch Buffalo units had been hammered across Java, Sumatra, Malaya, and Borneo. And the verdict in the source is not bad airplane. It's harsher and more specific. In the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the Buffalo was often arriving in a poor specification, facing better opponents, and too often being flown by pilots who simply didn't have the training to extract what the airframe still had left. By that stage, Commonwealth pilots weren't pretending the Buffalo was something it wasn't. They tried to get back what the early airplane had, its handling, by doing the simplest thing you can do to a fighter that's been loaded down: make it lighter. So units took extreme measures. Armor was removed, radio equipment was reduced or thrown out, fuel loads were managed the hard way, often only half filling the tanks, because every pound you didn't carry was something you didn't have to drag through a climb. And some aircraft even had their .50 caliber guns swapped for .303s, a change that could reduce weight but came with a penalty the source calls out. Those .303s had a habit of jamming, especially late in their service. None of this turned the Buffalo into a zero killer, but it did change what kind of airplane it was in the hands of pilots who understood the problem and were willing to work around it. And the transcript gives them credit for the outcome. Buffaloes in Commonwealth service still managed to shoot down over 80 Japanese aircraft, with the important qualifier that most of those victories were against bombers. For most American audiences, the Buffalo's reputation isn't built on Burma or Malaya. It's built on Midway, because that's one of the few moments when US Buffaloes met the Japanese head-on in a battle everyone remembers. The Marine Corps sent the Buffalo into the fight at Midway, and the numbers were brutal. 20 aircraft went up, 13 didn't come back. The transcript does not pretend it was a total no-show. It gives the airplane and the pilots credit where it's due. In the opening phase of the action, Buffaloes did shoot down Japanese bombers and dive bombers. But once the escort Zeros entered the fight, the situation collapsed fast. The Buffalo was outmatched in the kind of combat the Zero was built to dominate, and the losses piled up quickly. After Midway, the conclusion was hard to avoid. With the F-4F Wildcat being produced in greater numbers, and with more confidence behind it, the Buffalo's frontline days were effectively over. The remaining aircraft were sent back to the continental United States and shifted into training work, useful for teaching, but no longer trusted to carry the war. And this is the part of the story most people never hear, because it doesn't fit the worst fighter label. Finland signed a contract for 44 aircraft in December 1939, and what they bought was an export version similar to the F-2A1. It had a more powerful engine than the earliest Navy examples, but it also came with no armor protection at all. The trade was simple: less protection, more performance. The extra power let the Finns carry 4 guns instead of 2, and they stripped away Navy-only hardware, things like the tailhook, which helped both weight and aerodynamics. None of these aircraft made it into the initial Winter War of 1939–40, but they became workhorses in the continuation war, and the environment mattered. In the humid Pacific air, the Buffalo's engine had a reputation for running hot. In Finland's colder climate, it stayed cooler, and the airplane's strengths became easier to live with. Forgiving handling, good range, and a level of ruggedness pilots didn't expect from an aircraft that was being mocked elsewhere. The Buffalo's first Finnish action came on June 25, 1941. 2 aircraft intercepted a formation of 27 Soviet light bombers and shot down 5, a start that immediately changed how Finnish pilots viewed the machine. Over time, they built tactics around what the Buffalo did well, especially its turning ability. The signature method was the swarm, 4 Buffaloes operating as a team, with 2 flying low as bait and 2 flying high to pounce on anything that chased them. It was simple, disciplined, and effective. The numbers the transcript cites are staggering. Finland's No. 24 Fighter Squadron claimed 459 Soviet aircraft destroyed for the loss of just 15 Buffaloes in combat. Even the name tells you something. Americans didn't call it the Buffalo first, the British did. Finnish pilots used affectionate nicknames like Sky Pearl, Pearl of the Northern Skies, American Car, and Flying Beer Bottle. By late 1943, newer Soviet fighters, wear and tear, and a shortage of spare parts started to bite. Many Buffaloes were replaced by Bf-109Gs, but pilots kept scoring victories into mid-1944. And in 1944, after Finland's armistice with the Soviet Union, the Buffalo even closed its combat story by shooting down 2 German Ju-87s during the Lapland War. A final, overlooked proof that this airplane wasn't simply bad. It was often in the wrong place, in the wrong spec, at the wrong time.